So last thing we're going to take a look at today is the rose curves that have the form a sine n theta. So very similar to the a cosine n theta, it's just sine here. So really the only difference is going to be where the graph's going to start, or where your petals are going to start. Okay, so just to kind of go over your a value, or the absolute value of your a value, is going to tell you the length of your petals. Same thing here. This n value is odd, then that means you're going to have n petals. But if n is even, then you have to double n to get how many petals you're going to have. Just like with what we looked at previously. The radial lines is the main difference. So remember, radial lines tell you where your petals are going to go. So you're always going to start at pi over 2n. So this place where you're going to start is the big difference, okay? Remember when it said cosine, you were either going to start at 0 or at pi, but for radial lines, you're always going to start at pi over 2n. After that, you're going to be adding 2 pi over the number of petals. Okay, just like we did on cosine. So this right here is the main difference. We're going to start at pi over 2n whenever we have sine of n theta. So let's jump on into a problem. So we have r equals 2 sine 3 theta. Okay, so things we need to talk about. First off, circle or rose curve. Well, it's going to be a rose curve because of that 3. Next is the length of the petals. The length of the petals comes from the number out front, which is your a value. So the length of the petals is going to be 2. Next is how many petals are we going to have. Because our n value 3 is odd, we're just going to have 3 petals. And then we have to worry about our radial lines. So radial lines tell you where are your petals going to go. So, because this is a sine rose curve, we're going to start at, the formula is pi over 2n. So we're going to start at pi over, well, n is 3, so we're going to start at pi over 6. Okay? We're going to be adding to this 2 pi over the number of petals. Well, we have 3 petals, so 2 pi over 3. Okay? So we're starting at pi over 6, we're adding 2 pi over 3. Now, because this is in terms of a denominator 6, I'm going to go ahead and change this. It's the same thing as 4 pi over 6 that we're going to be adding. Okay. So, first radial line is going to be at pi over 6. To pi over 6, we need to add 4 pi over 6. So, our next one's going to be at 5 pi over 6. And then, if we add another 4 pi over 6, that'll give us 9 pi over 6. Which is fine, but that needs to be reduced so we'll know what it is in the unit circle. So it's going to be at 3 pi over 2. So 3 petals, so 3 radial lines, and that's where they're going to go. So, graphing this, we are always going to have this point in the center. The first radial line is at pi over 6, because this is pi over 6, and the length of our petals is only 2 this time. So we're just going to count up 2. So our first petal looks something like this. Then we're at 5 pi over 6. So 5 pi over 6 is over here in the second quadrant. We're only counting up 2. So put our dot here. So our second petal is going to look something like that. And then our final petal is supposed to go at 3 pi over 2, which is down here. So we're going to count 2 spaces. And we're going to draw in our final petal, which is here. So they're evenly spaced out. That line is not supposed to be there. But if you were just looking at the graph, a way to tell that this is a sine graph and not a cosine rose curve is because it doesn't start on the polar axis. It doesn't start at 0 or at pi. It starts here at pi over 6. So that's a big way to tell the difference between sine and cosine. Alright, so last problem. We're working with 3 sine 2 theta. Alright, so first off, this is going to be a rose curve because we have this 2. Next, we want to set the length of our petals. The length of the petals comes from the A value, which is the number out front. So the length of the petals is going to be 3. Number of petals comes from your N value. Well, the N value is 2 because that's even. We have to double it, so we actually have 4 petals. And then last, we have our radial lines. So for our radial lines, because this is a sine, we have to start at pi over 2n. Well, that's going to be starting at pi over 2 times 2, so starting at pi over 4. We're going to add to that 2 pi over the number of petals. Well, the number of petals is 4. Okay? So pi over 4 is going to be our first radial line. We're going to add 2 pi over 4 to that, which will give us 3 pi over 4. If we add another 2 pi over 4, that's going to get us to 5 pi over 4. If we add another 2 pi over 4, that's going to get us to 7 pi over 4. We have 4 petals, so we're only going to have 4 radial lines. So when we go to graph this, we're going to have our line, or our point at the pole. The first one is at pi over 4, so that's the middle line here, and it says we have a length of 3. So we're going to draw in our petal. Okay, then we're at 3 pi over 4, and we have a length of 3. I'm getting worse at this. This video goes on. Okay, that's not good. And then at 5 pi over 4, we're here, 3. And then the last one, we're at 7 pi over 4 and at 3. So it's really the middle radial lines for each quadrant. So, something like that. It looks rough. But that is our rose curve. And we know it's a sine one if we were just looking at it because it doesn't start on this polar axis. So 0 or at pi. So, 2 different polar shapes for today. We have circles and we have rose curves. Tomorrow we will look at 2 other types.